Chapter 4. Well, the thing exploded on Tuesday, the 26th of August. I had risen at my usual time and had breakfast, but was not good for much because of the pain in my spine. It had been troubling me badly of late and forcing me to take opiates when it got too unbearable. Nobody else was downstairs except the servants, though I could hear Marceline moving about in her room. Marsh slept in the attic next his studio and had begun to keep such late hours that he was seldom up till noon. About 10 o'clock the pain got the better of me, so that I took a double dose of my opiate and lay down on the parlour sofa. The last I heard was Marceline's pacing overhead. Poor creature, if I had known. She must have been walking before the long mirror, admiring herself. That was like her, vain from start to finish, revelling in her own beauty just as she revelled in all the little luxuries Denny was able to give her. I didn't wake up till near sunset and knew instantly how long I had slept from the golden light and long shadows outside the long window. Nobody was about, and a sort of unnatural stillness seemed to be hovering over everything. From afar, though, I thought I could sense a faint howling, wild and intermittent, whose quality had a slight but baffling familiarity about it. I'm not much for psychic premonitions, but I was frightfully uneasy from the start. There had been dreams, even worse than the ones I had been dreaming in the weeks before, and this time they seemed hideously linked to some black and festering reality. The whole place had a poisonous air. Afterward I reflected that certain sounds must have filtered through to my unconscious brain during those hours of drugged sleep. My pain, though, was very much eased, and I rose and walked without difficulty. Soon enough I began to see that something was wrong. Marsh and Marceline might have been riding, but someone ought to have been getting dinner in the kitchen. Instead, there was only silence except for that faint, distant howl or wail, and nobody answered when I pulled the old-fashioned bell cord to summon Scipio. Then, chancing to look up, I saw the spreading stain on the ceiling, the bright red stain that must have come through the floor of Marceline's room. In an instant I forgot my crippled back and hurried upstairs to find out the worst. Everything under the sun raced through my mind as I struggled with the dampness-warped door of that silent chamber, and most hideous of all was a terrible sense of malign fulfillment and fatal expectedness. I had, it struck me, known all along that nameless horrors were gathering, that something profoundly and cosmically evil had gained a foothold under my roof, from which only blood and tragedy could result. The door gave at last, and I stumbled into the large room beyond, all dim from the branches of the great trees outside the windows. For a moment I could do nothing but flinch at the faint, evil odour that immediately struck my nostrils. Then, turning on the electric light and glancing around, I glimpsed a nameless blasphemy on the yellow and blue rug. It lay face down in a great pool of dark, thickened blood, and had the gory print of a shod human foot in the middle of its naked back. Blood was spattered everywhere, on the walls, furniture and floor. My knees gave way as I took in the sight, so that I had to stumble to a chair and slump down. The thing had obviously been a human being, though its identity was not easy to establish at first, since it was without clothes and had most of its hair hacked and torn from the scalp in a very crude way. It was of a deep ivory colour, and I knew that it must have been Marceline. The shoe print on the back made the thing seem all the more hellish. I could not even picture the strange, loathsome tragedy which must have taken place while I slept in the room below. When I raised my hand to wipe my dripping forehead, I saw that my fingers were sticky with blood. I shuddered, then realized that it must have come from the knob of the door which the unknown murderer had forced shut behind him as he left. He had taken his weapon with him, it seemed, for no instrument of death was visible here. As I studied the floor, I saw that a line of sticky footprints, like the one on the body, led away from the horror to the door. There was another blood trail too, and of a less easily explainable kind, a broadish, continuous line, as if marking the path of some huge snake. At first I concluded it must be due to something the murderer had dragged after him. Then, noting the way some of the footprints seemed to be superimposed on it, I was forced to believe that it had been there when the murderer left. But what crawling entity could have been in that room with the victim and her assassin, leaving before the killer when the deed was done? As I asked myself this question, I thought I heard fresh bursts of that faint, distant wailing. Finally, rousing myself from a lethargy of horror, I got on my feet again and began following the footprints. Who the murderer was, I could not even faintly guess, nor could I try to explain the absence of the servants. I vaguely felt that I ought to go up to Marsh's attic quarters, but before I had fully formulated the idea, I saw that the bloody trail was indeed taking me there. Was he himself the murderer? Had he gone mad under the strain of the morbid situation and suddenly run amok? In the attic corridor, the trail became faint, the prints almost ceasing as they merged with the dark carpet. I could still, however, discern the strange single path of the entity who had gone first, and this led straight to the closed door of Marsh's studio, disappearing beneath it at a point about halfway from side to side. Evidently it had crossed the threshold at a time when the door was wide open. Sick at heart, I tried the knob and found the door unlocked. Opening it, I paused in the waning north light to see what fresh nightmare might be awaiting me. There was certainly something human on the floor, and I reached for the switch to turn on the chandelier. But as the light flashed up, my gaze left the floor and its horror. That was Marsh, poor devil, to fix itself frantically and incredulously upon the living thing that cowered and stared in the open doorway leading to Marsh's bedroom. It was a tousled, wild-eyed thing, crusted with dried blood, and carrying in its hand a wicked machete which had been one of the ornaments of the studio wall. Yet even in that awful moment I recognized it as one whom I had thought more than 1,000 miles away. It was my own boy, Denis, or the maddened wreck, which had once been Denis. The sight of me seemed to bring back a trifle of sanity, or at least of memory, in the poor boy. He straightened up and began to toss his head about as if trying to shake free from some enveloping influence. I could not speak a word, but moved my lips in an effort to get back my voice. My eyes wandered for a moment to the figure on the floor in front of the heavily draped easel, the figure toward which the strange blood trail led, and which seemed to be tangled in the coils of some dark, ropey object. The shifting of my glance apparently produced some impression in the twisted brain of the boy, for suddenly he began to mutter in a hoarse whisper whose purport I was soon able to catch. I had to exterminate her. She was the devil, the summit and high priestess of all evil, the spawn of the pit. Marsh knew and tried to warn me. Good old Frank, I didn't kill him, though I was ready to before I realized. But I went down there and killed her, then that cursed hair. I listened in horror as Denny choked, paused, and began again. You didn't know. Her letters got queer, and I knew she was in love with Marsh. Then she nearly stopped writing. He never mentioned her. I felt something was wrong and thought I ought to come back and find out. Couldn't tell you. Your manner would have given it away. Wanted to surprise them. Got here about noon today. Came in a cab and sent the house servants all off. Let the field hands alone, for their cabins are all out of earshot. Told McCabe to get me some things in Cape Girardeau and not bother to come back till tomorrow. Had all the niggers take the old car and let Mary drive them to Bend Village for a vacation. Told them we were all going on some sort of outing and wouldn't need help. Said they'd better stay all night with Uncle Skip's cousin, who keeps that nigger boarding house. Dennis was getting very incoherent now, and I strained my ears to grasp every word. Again, I thought I heard that wild, far-off wail, but the story had first place for the present. Saw you sleeping in the parlour and took a chance. You wouldn't wake up. Then went upstairs on the quiet to hunt up Marsh and that woman. The boy shuddered as he avoided pronouncing Marceline's name. At the same time, I saw his eyes dilate in unison with a bursting of the distant crying, whose vague familiarity had now become very great. She was not in her room, so I went up to the studio. Door was shut, and I could hear voices inside. Didn't knock, just burst in and found her posing for the picture. Nude, but with that hellish hair all draped around her, and making all sorts of sheep's eyes at Marsh. He had the easel turned half away from the door, so I couldn't see the picture. Both of them were pretty well jolted when I showed up, and Marsh dropped his brush. I was in a rage and told him he'd have to show me the portrait, but he got calmer every minute. Told me it wasn't quite done, but would be in a day or two, said I could see it then. She hadn't seen it. But that didn't go with me. I stepped up and he dropped a velvet curtain over the thing before I could see it. He was ready to fight before letting me see it. But that she stepped up and sided with me. Said we ought to see it. Frank got horribly worked up and gave me a punch when I tried to get at the curtain. I punched back and seemed to have knocked him out. Then I was almost knocked out myself by the shriek that creature gave. She'd drawn aside the hangings herself and had caught a look at what Marsh had been painting. I wheeled around and saw her rushing like mad out of the room. Then I saw the picture. Madness flared up in the boy's eyes again as he got to this place, and I thought for a minute he was going to spring at me with his machete. But after a pause, he partly steadied himself. Oh, God, that thing. Don't ever look at it, burn it with the hangings around it and throw the ashes into the river. Marsh knew and was warning me. He knew what it was, what that woman, that leopardess or gorgon or lamia or whatever she was, actually represented. He'd tried to hint to me ever since I met her in his Paris studio, but it couldn't be told in words. I thought they all wronged her when they whispered horrors about her. She had me hypnotized so that I couldn't believe the plain facts. But this picture has caught the whole secret, the whole monstrous background. God, but Frank is an artist. That thing is the greatest piece of work any living soul has produced since Rembrandt. It's a crime to burn it, but it would be a greater crime to let it exist, just as it would have been an abhorrent sin to let that she-demon exist any longer. The minute I saw it, I understood what she was and what part she played in the frightful secret that has come down from the days of Cthulhu and the Elder Ones. The secret that was nearly wiped out when Atlantis sank, but that kept half alive in hidden traditions and allegorical myths and furtive midnight cult practices. For you know she was the real thing. It wasn't any fake. It would have been merciful if it had been a fake. It was the old, hideous shadow that philosophers never dared mention, the thing hinted at in the Necronomicon and symbolized in the Easter Island Colossi. She thought we couldn't see through, that the false front would hold till we had bartered away our immortal souls, and she was half right. She'd have got me in the end. She was only waiting. But Frank, good old Frank, was too much for me. He knew what it all meant, and painted it. I don't wonder she shrieked and ran off when she saw it. It wasn't quite done, but God knows enough was there. Then I knew I'd got to kill her, and everything connected with her. It was a taint that wholesome human blood couldn't bear. There was something else too, but you'll never know that if you burn the picture without looking. I staggered down to her room with this machete that I got off the wall here, leaving Frank still knocked out. He was breathing though, and I knew and thanked heaven that I hadn't killed him. I found her in front of the mirror, braiding that accursed hair. She turned on me like a wild beast and began spitting out her hatred of Marsh. The fact that she'd been in love with him, and I knew she had, only made it worse. For a minute I couldn't move, and she came within an ace of completely hypnotizing me. Then I thought of the picture, and the spell broke. She saw the breaking in my eyes, and must have noticed the machete too. I never saw anything give such a wild, jungle beast look as she did then. She sprang for me with claws out like a leopard's, but I was too quick. I swung the machete and it was all over. Denny had to stop again there, and I saw the perspiration running down his forehead through the spattered blood, but in a moment he hoarsely resumed. I said it was all over, but God, some of it had only just begun. I felt I had fought the legions of Satan and put my foot on the back of the thing I had annihilated. Then I saw that blasphemous braid of coarse black hair begin to twist and squirm of itself. I might have known it. It was all in the old tales. That damnable hair had a life of its own that couldn't be ended by killing the creature itself. I knew I'd have to burn it, so I started to hack it off with the machete. God, but it was devilish work, tough, like iron wires, but I managed to do it. And it was loathsome the way the big braid writhed and struggled in my grasp. About the time I had the last strand cut or pulled off, I heard that eldritch wailing from behind the house. You know, it's still going off and on. I don't know what it is, but it must be something springing from this hellish business. It half seems like something I ought to know but can't quite place. It got my nerves the first time I heard it, and I dropped the severed braid in my fright. Then I got a worse fright, for in another second the braid had turned on me and began to strike venomously with one of its ends, which had knotted itself up like a sort of grotesque head. I struck out with the machete, and it turned away. Then, when I had my breath again, I saw that the monstrous thing was crawling along the floor by itself like a great black snake. I couldn't do anything for a while, but when it vanished through the door, I managed to pull myself together and stumble after it. I could follow the broad, bloody trail, and I saw it led upstairs. It brought me here, and may heaven curse me if I didn't see it through the doorway, striking at poor dazed Marsh like a maddened rattler as it had struck at me, finally coiling around him as a python would. He had begun to come to, but that abominable serpent thing got him before he was on his feet. I knew that all of that woman's hatred was behind it, but I hadn't the power to pull it off. I tried, but it was too much for me. Even the machete was no good. I couldn't swing it freely, or it would have slashed Frank to pieces. So I saw those monstrous coils tighten, saw poor Frank crushed to death before my eyes. And all the time that awful faint howling came from somewhere beyond the fields. That's all. I pulled the velvet cloth over the picture and hope it'll never be lifted. The thing must be burnt. I couldn't pry the coils off poor dead Frank. They cling to him like a leech and seem to have lost their motion altogether. It's as if that snaky rope of hair has a kind of perverse fondness for the man it killed. It's clinging to him, embracing him. You'll have to burn poor Frank with it, but for God's sake, don't forget to see it in ashes. That and the picture, they must both go. The safety of the world demands that they go. Denny might have whispered more, but a fresh burst of distant wailing cut us short. For the first time we knew what it was, for a westerly veering wind brought articulate words at last. We ought to have known long before, since sounds much like it had often come from the same source. It was wrinkled Sophonisba, the ancient Zulu witch-woman who had fawned on Marceline, keening from her cabin in a way which crowned the horrors of this nightmare tragedy. We could both hear some of the things she howled, and knew that secret and primordial bonds linked this savage sorceress with that other inheritor of elder secrets who had just been extirpated. Some of the words she used betrayed her closeness to demonic and Pelagian traditions. Yeah, shoob niggurath, yarlaya, ngagi, mbulubuanan lolo, yo, poor Missy Tanit, poor Missy Isis, Marseille Cthulhu, come up out in the water and git your chiley, she done dade, de hair ain't got no missus no more, Marseille Cthulhu. Old Sophie, she know. Old Sophie, she done got the black stone out and big Zimbabwe and old Afriki. Old Sophie, she done dance in the moonshine round the crocodile stone before the Mbangas cotch her and sell her to the ship folks. No more Tanit, no more Isis, no more witch woman to keep the fire a-going in the big stone place. Yo, Ngagin Bulu Buananalolo, Shub Niggurath. She dade, old Sophie no. That wasn't the end of the wailing, but it was all I could pay attention to. The expression on my boy's face showed that it had reminded him of something frightful, and the tightening of his hand on the machete boded no good. I knew he was desperate and sprang to disarm him if possible before he could do anything more. But I was too late. An old man with a bad spine doesn't count for much physically. There was a terrible struggle, but he had done for himself before many seconds were over. I'm not sure yet, but that he tried to kill me too. His last panting words were something about the need of wiping out everything that had been connected with Marceline, either by blood or marriage.